So who's introducing who? Which podcast are we on, Chris?
Oh boy. I mean, I guess we're going to do a cross release here. Is that the plan?
I think between the three of us, we've got 5 podcasts, 8 YouTube channels. So it'll emerge somewhere.
Welcome to the Titans of Decoupling, or the
I love it.
Titans
Titans of Decouple. Yeah. Or energy decoupling impact Titans.
Beautiful. Some combination of the above. Yeah.
Okay, well, no, I'm super excited to get a chance to. I mean, we chat all the time, but it's great to record something again, especially with all your progress. I mean, I've just been watching in amazement. I mean, I always just had so much admiration for what you've done with your podcast, then your Decouple Studios, but now just to see this political action that you've taken also, I'm just sitting back watching in awe. So yeah, can't wait to hear all about it.
Yeah, I mean, likewise, I've been dying to get you back on. Your anthropology of nuclear was a very popular episode, and you definitely have the heterodox ideas that I think are needed to break through some of the, how do we put it? I mean, there's so much conservatism in the nuclear world. The communications I find are just so tightly cloistered. The idea of having an open debate and sharing some exciting ideas, I think, feels like the equivalent of a reactor meltdown to people within this sector. So I think it's great having, I very much consider myself an outsider. But we've definitely kind of come to this from an outsider perspective, and both run these podcasts and talk to, it's hard to keep track of everybody, but they've all sort of left their little imprint on us and influenced our thinking. And that's been, I think, really good, because coming as outsiders, we've been able to incorporate a lot of different ideas rather than being sort of subspecialized in a certain field or with a lens of, we'll only be able to see things in one light. So.
For sure. No, it's actually funny hearing you call me heterodox when my main idea is let's just build what we've always built.
Right.
Let's just build the normal reactor is my main idea. So heterodox.
Pretty edgy, Bret. Yeah.
Cool. Well, yeah. So take me back to now. It's all blending together. What has been going over publicly versus what you and I just chat about. But kind of take me back to some of the recent political action that has occurred. I mean, actually, I'm going to make you tell a little bit of the story, even though I've heard you speak about it publicly. But tell me a little bit of the story when you approached that person at the German guy at COP. Did that kind of kick off a little bit of your political antagonism?
No, we have to go way further back into the past for that. I think, at COP, probably the big bang moment was this interview, a bit of a ambush interview with our famously anti-nuclear environment minister, Mr. Stephen Guilbeault, who spent 10 years, I think, working within Greenpeace, 10 years within a Canadian environmental group that he started. He rappelled off of the CN Tower, which was once the tallest tower in the world, to bring attention to climate change. I think he got released on $50,000 bail. He's a legit green activist. And he was brought in to our current government to signal that they were serious about climate change. And anyway, we had this moment, and it's just the product of, so much of, you're mentioning the growth of the podcast, Decouple Studios, being able to bring people on board on this journey has been absolutely incredible. And so, this great friend of mine, Jesse Freeston, who's a very talented filmmaker, videographer, video journalist, was at COP, and we caught this moment. And I think it's probably a little bit generous to say it went viral, but we got, I think over 10,000 views of this interaction with this minister, where I just said, is your anti-nuclear past going to cloud your judgment as minister? Is that going to mean that you will ignore really the scientific consensus where the IPCC is saying that, nuclear needs to increase in all 4 of our illustrative decarbonization pathways? And he dodged the question, no, it's not up to the market. Sorry, it's not up to the government. Markets will decide. And then 5 months later, he releases this green bond framework, saying that nuclear is essentially a sin stock. It's gambling, it's tobacco, it's firearms, it's smoking.
How is that still possible? I remember that being nuclear being clustered with tobacco, firearms 10 years ago in the however they categorize these things, or maybe even more. I don't know. I wasn't around, but I'm looking at it okay, it was stuck in the UN classification or some EU classification that says, how is this still going on today? This is crazy.
Yeah, it's starting to change. And that's what I've sort of been giving the government hell on. The ruling party is, their justification for this exclusion and the lumping in with the sin stocks is, well, this is just, we're basing it on best practice in terms of green finance. Of course, they're ignoring the EU sustainable finance taxonomy, which may be fair play. I think it's the final vote is in May when it will be kind of written into law. But apparently the French green bond doesn't include nuclear. The Ontario green bond, my province, which is 62% powered by nuclear, does not include nuclear. That's all changing. That's all changing soon. But in terms of these changes, we have Bruce Power, the world's largest operating nuclear plant, which is run on a private-public partnership. They issued a green bond worth $500 million that was oversubscribed 6 times. So we know that if you include it, capital will come. And we know that when you actually expose it to scientific investigation, as was done, with the EU Sustainable Finance Taxonomy with the Joint Research Commission, we know that it gets included. So the argument here in Canada has really been, let's lead on this, not make excuses. But we'll get into more details of sort of some of the conversations I had. But the real surprise for me is that I got into this advocacy work about 3 years ago. In 2019, we held our first Stand Up for Nuclear event, Nathan Phillips Square. It's one of the main public squares in Toronto. We were there illegally because we didn't reserve the square. We just brought some folding tables, literally hand-drawn posters. I'm a pretty shitty graphic designer, but I made some pamphlets and crammed on way too much information and graphs from various places, and talked to passersby, talked to homeless people, talked to mentally ill people up on their milk cartons, preaching their version of the gospel. Just talk to anybody. And then 3 years later, in the West Block in the House of Parliament, talking with cabinet ministers, senators, making presentations to the caucuses of the two the two natural parties of government. We have 4 parties in Canada, but 2 are the ones that always form government, and it's just been a dizzying ride. And so I can't quite explain it, but
you just yada over a lot of stuff that happened there. So what was the moment that you started being treated as an authority amongst these political I don't even want to call them elites, but just these political people, like the government people? When did they start coming to you and saying, "Hey, Chris, you clearly know what you're talking about"?
It's I'm trying to put a pin in that spot. It's been very interesting doing the podcast, which I speak to philosophers, I speak to engineers, I speak to activists and advocates. Ultimately, I'm goal driven. It just happens to be that nuclear ticks the most boxes that I'm after in terms of, climate concern, biodiversity, maintaining industrial capacity in the West, just transition. It just coincides with ticking a lot of boxes, but I try and maintain a sort of challenge my cognitive dissonance, be open, but I am also a player. I'm an advocate. I feel like I need to put my convictions into action, and so that process again began with these kind of stand up for nuclear events, but we have some very interesting tools available to us. And I talk about this sometimes, right? This idea of a David and Goliath on a battle of ideas, right? There is an ideological battle of ideas happening. And right now, unfortunately, it's kind of between big green NGOs, the kind of what I'll call the eco-romantics, and the people who subscribe to that pseudo-religious narrative of we've sinned against Mother Earth by industrializing, we have to go back to the Garden of Eden. And then we have, for lack of a better term, maybe team eco-modern, team innovation, which says, no, we are problem solvers. Humans are incredible. We're constantly solving problems and creating new ones for ourselves. We do not have the luxury of hitting the rewind button. We need to continue to innovate. And, whether that's on the energy front with nuclear, moving up the energy density ladder, moving up the energy return, energy invested ladder, whether it's with agricultural tools across the board. We face some of the greatest challenges, of our time. And we have one set of ideas, which is saying we should just abandon what we do best, which is think, innovate, invent. But in terms of that David and Goliath setting, I don't have the numbers, for Canada. I think I have a better sense of the US. You have about $1 billion of annual operating revenue for groups like the Sierra Club, Natural Resource Defense Council, wow, Friends of the Earth, and others. And in terms of that sort of team eco-modern, whatever that is, in terms of think tanks that are actually advocating on that file, I'd be surprised if it's more than 10 million.
Yeah.
So you have several orders of magnitude difference. And and sort of sallying force onto that battleground is an interesting thing. And so for me, I'm always looking at, how can I get sort of greatest return on energy, on sort of my activist energy invested. And a lot of it is, well, don't reinvent the wheel, like see what the antis are up to, right? And so that led me a couple of years ago to looking at what Sierra Club Canada was up to, and they had this mechanism. It's a House of Commons petition. I think it's a Commonwealth thing. So all the sort of countries colonized by England. If you get a sufficient number of signatures in a sponsoring MP, your petition is read on the floor of the House of Commons, and it mandates a written response from government.
Wow.
And that's cool. It's a very neat democratic mechanism.
Yeah, that's democracy. Nice.
It really is. It really is. And so I just been sort of seeing, okay, what are the antis up to? Oh, what's this? Oh, there's this petition. Oh, I didn't know about that. Now, these are groups that have, a historical legacy. They have an institutional memory. They've been exploring what are the best advocacy tools. What are these little, what in video games, these little cheats, or what do you call it? Level up secrets?
Cheat codes or something. I don't know. Yeah.
Cheat codes. Yeah. And so that was probably the way that I sort of got introduced into the political process. I got my local MP again sponsored that petition, and that went somewhere. And then the other thing is, I moved into another riding not too long ago, and it was actually a decouple listener who's involved a lot in local politics started talking my MP's ear off about what she was hearing about on decouple. So wow. Apparently that led to him saying, hey, I got to reach out to him, and we started talking. And this is not a nuclear riding. If anything, this is more of an environmental NGO type riding. So I have to give this MP, Arif Irani, a lot of credit, because I think he's really acting in a principled manner and listening, studying the issue, and maybe even risking his political skin slightly in this in terms of his riding. But I think he's someone who believes in science and following the best evidence and listening to expertise.
Pretty amazing.
I'm giving a way too long of an answer here, but
no. I'm enjoying listening to it. No, it's like a masterclass kind of, because I say what we do is advocacy, but really what I've focused most of our attention on is really just trying to learn and just trying to see what needs to be done, and then as a byproduct, we do advocacy. But we haven't really ever tried to optimize. I haven't thought about it like you, what are the tools at our disposal. So it's pretty amazing to watch what you're doing, and also a lot of our friends, like Mark Nelson and the others, to just kind of watch how everyone is really doing advocacy. I almost think what I'm doing is fake advocacy. I'm trying to learn, I'm trying to make a difference, and I'm giving away my journey, to everybody, right. Also, but it's a different thing.
Yeah. I mean, definitely your podcast was out before mine. I remember you're one of the inspirations for me jumping into the host seat. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So tell me more about the political discourse in Canada and just what you've seen change over the last year, and where maybe you've changed your own mind on how to approach things over the last year as well.
Right. I mean, in terms of this whole nuclear advocacy thing, I've been thinking a lot about, how to build a base. Because I think within politics, there's voting blocks, which politicians will respect. There's, the number of signatures you can mobilize on a petition, the number of letters you can get sent to a parliamentarian, for instance. But also just in terms of, again, of a battle of ideas, if you are able to build a critical mass of people who really believe in something, that becomes, it develops a sort of magnetism, and it's able to draw in others. It's able to normalize, it's able to send signals. I think a lot about, why we hold the beliefs that we do. And especially early on in Decouple, we engaged a lot with these ideas around sort of, tribalism. We see it a lot with COVID now, right? In terms of people hold beliefs that they really haven't investigated deeply out of a tribal identity. And I think, tools like Twitter tend to really hyper polarize us and put us even more into those camps.
Harden or ossify some of these beliefs. Yeah.
Right. But how do we change beliefs that just kind of emerge from our context, our political context, our class context, et cetera? A lot of it is, I think, just paleo psychology, right? It's how did we in the old days, in our evolutionary history, how did we develop ideas and change positions? And a lot of it has to do with, this kind of culture of influencers right now. And, maximum respect to folks like Isabel Bemeke and others who are signaling, and I think she's having huge impacts in terms of bringing along, oh God, what's Elon's ex's name again? Blanking on the name right now, but
Oh yeah, the singer.
She's making it safe for Grimes. She's making it safe for Grimes and others to sort of come forward and normalize it. But in terms of political advocacy and really mobilizing a movement, I was looking around and I was like, well, who do I talk to, right? Because I think within nuclear advocacy, there's a tendency to want to just argue with the people who are yelling at you the loudest, and that's almost always a massive mistake. I mean, there's I think
sometimes there are people who actually have beliefs that are pretty close to yours also. Isn't that interesting? Kind of like in religion sometimes too. It's like when you see like slight variations on Christianity, variations on Islam, and they're the ones attacking each other.
Kill each other over it, yeah.
But sometimes even in like the environmental advocacy space, okay, you see environmentalists going after each other. Even within the nuclear advocacy space, you see some going after each other. So it's like, what's going on there? That's some part of natural human psychology too, right?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. No, I mean, don't get me started on the. I think in one of my episodes with Michael Schellenberger, I revealed this kind of taxonomy of nuclear, which he quite liked, but I don't want to stick my toes in the factional waters again. But I think I lost my train of thought there. In terms of that,
you say making it safe. New voices are coming out, making it safe for
and how to build a movement. Needing that critical mass. And so certainly we're lucky within Canada. I mean, I've talked to allies in Australia, for instance, and they're just starting, nuclear is illegal there. They make some isotopes, but they don't have like a sector, an industry or people involved in it. And so from day one, I've really been assessing, well, who are the actors at play here? Is it, my fellow environmentalists? Is it the Green Party? And I engaged for a while there, and I certainly it's like a whetstone kind of sharpening the edge of your blade. They keep you on your toes because you have to look up absolutely every bizarre myth or dogma that they have and dispel it. But are they sort of that block that you are going to be able to mobilize and create a movement with? No, I mean, they bark loudly. So there's a tendency, especially with the social media thing, just to like, well, let's just argue that, but they become kind of like a vampire that can really eat up a lot of your time, which could be used much more productively to make change in the world.
Yeah.
And so for me, it was, there's 76,000 people working within the sector, and they're people who I consider to be, clean air, climate, medical isotope heroes. So let's figure out a way to meet them where they're at, interact with them, and see if we can mobilize them, get them politically active, get them signing petitions, getting them writing letters, getting them coming to rallies. And that's been the secret sauce here in terms of, you're asking sort of when the rubber hit the road. It was really the second petition that we did on the green bond, which, in that interim year, I'd spent just relationship building right across the sector, but mostly with unions and workers. And so, when we developed this petition, we were able to send it out to a number of email listservs that hit probably 70,000 people in total. Wow. And so we got 10,000 signatures. Some of those are coming certainly from outside the sector, but a lot of those are just everyday working men and women in the nuclear sector who are saying, yeah, I'm not, you're calling me the moral equivalent of working in gambling. Like, I make the medical isotopes that enable modern healthcare, that sterilize 40% of the world's, single-use medical devices. And you're saying I'm the equivalent of a tobacco manufacturer.
Yeah, and you went over that pretty quickly, so I'm just going to slow that down for a second for the audience. That whole part about making the sterilizing the medical equipment, because it is a pretty powerful argument. The thing that people are so worried about, radiation, which maybe they don't understand, but okay, they're concerned, and probably rightfully concerned, just because it's not their fault that just because this is how society has characterized this thing. But either way, this thing radiation is used so effectively for health, across a variety of tools of medicine. But the one you were just talking about is sterilizing medical equipment. And once again, you said pretty fast, so I want to just slow down around it.
Yeah.
Isn't it one? You're saying it's one facility in Canada does most of the world's sterilization, or what was it?
Yeah, I mean, it's this wonderful feature of a pressurized heavy reactor pressurized heavy water reactor system like the Candu that we have. So between Bruce and Pickering, we produce the majority of the world's cobalt-60, which is a absolutely vital gamma source for sterilizing, a whole number of things. But 40% of the world's single-use medical devices are sterilized with cobalt-60 from our facilities, in Ontario. And there are other means of making isotopes, but different isotopes require different environments, and to produce at scale, there's nothing better than a Candu for that.
Yeah.
I work in healthcare, right? This is my bread and butter. And I was talking with someone from the medical isotopes body here in Canada, and it just really hit home for me. Like that IV cannula that I'm putting in that patient, that endotracheal breathing tube that's going in that patient, that artificial hip joint that's going in that patient. These things are all made possible by medical isotopes. And there's you can autoclave, you can use high temperature steam and things like that, but a lot of things will melt if you try and do that to them. We use a lot of plastics in medicine, and that's kind of what's made medicine so accessible and so kind of mass producible. And then on an even more personal note, my dad is currently getting a cancer treatment, lutetium-177, which they're scaling up at Bruce right now.
Wow.
So there's just things got really personal for me pretty fast with these things. And you've heard studies like Dr. James Edward Hansen did a study looking at, making an estimate based on air pollution statistics, how many people have been saved as a result of nuclear energy. And they estimated, I think, 1.8 million lives. But if you were to think about, the consequences of a lack of sterility in healthcare environments, and then also if you want to think about cancer treatments with radiation, I mean, it's
billions. So I just don't understand why we can't. Well, I mean, this is just going to sound like complaining, but I'll take my privilege. Like, I find it pretty disturbing the way that the nuclear industry historically has handled communication. There's such an amazing story to tell there about the clean air, the medical tools, and rebranding nuclear. Like, keep the word nuclear, but just surround it with all this positivity.
Yeah.
But the habit that we so often fall back onto, and I almost I'll call you out. I almost caught you doing it a little bit of times, and me too, by the way. I'm calling myself out also. Falling back into the defensive rhythm, where it's like, okay, so here's this myth. Let me dispel this myth. But then if we don't do it right, I know we're collaborating on trying to figure out how to do that a little bit better. But it's a weakness of mine too, falling into the defensive nature. And I just feel like that doesn't send the right, because people aren't going to be, listen, I don't actually think people are ever convinced by facts. I think people are convinced by emotional arguments. Or if someone wants to be convinced by facts, they'll be convinced by facts. But if someone comes from a totally different place, they're going to be convinced by emotional arguments more than
emotional arguments. And also, again, we look to leadership, right? We look to thought leaders. Like within medicine, I mean, I can't I look at, critically appraise all of the emerging epidemiologic evidence about the various treatments that are out there, right? I'm trained to do so. And I can do that for, a small area of practice that's within my scope, emergency medicine. But I very much rely on thought leaders, people who I know have excellent values, integrity, morality, who are better at it or spend a greater percent of their professional life doing it. And I have to, I'll read what they write. There's summaries of the literature, and I'll say, yeah, that makes sense to me. I don't have the time to digest all of the primary literature to arrive at every conclusion I have. So we do, with this fact thing, a lot of it is, is this an influencer? Is this a leader who has the kind of ethics and integrity? And am I going to base a little bit of my comfort with this in what I see them embracing or thinking about?
Okay, such a good point. But this has been a huge weakness of the nuclear industry, because if you look around at the thought leaders, the expert scientific minds, especially when it comes to a topic of waste, what do? They say we need to spend billions of dollars storing it deep underground, devoting our national labs attention to solving the issue. And therefore they reinforce this underlying falsehood that nuclear waste is like a hazard, it's like this dangerous hazard that we have to deal with. Right?
It's unbelievable.
These are the experts. The experts are the experts in the nuclear industry, many of which I know, by the way, and are good people, and I like them, but they'll fall into these political positions, or they'll fall into these national lab positions. This is how they're going to get grant money. And so they go around, reinforcing this lie that nuclear waste is a hazard. So like, what are we going to do about
I mean,
that?
I talked to someone recently about this, and I was asking. It was a Canadian focused episode. We haven't published it yet. We might have to re-record it because of a sound quality issue. You know, one of the great tragedies of podcasting is occasionally having an issue like that. But you know, based upon the Postiva study of the Finnish repository, right, where they're looking at, okay, worst case scenario, all of the engineered barriers break down in 1,000 years, which is, you know, way before they could ever probably do so. You know, what's the worst case scenario to someone living in the most contaminated spot, quote unquote contaminated, eating food grown only on the most contaminated spot, drinking water from the most contaminated spot, and it was an excess dose equivalent to 2 extra bananas per year.
So crazy.
Right. And so the question, I mean, that's even a whole hypothetical scenario, right? Of, you know, things breaking down in 1,000 years. But, you know, I was like, well, what could you do for 4 banana dose per year at 1,000 years into the worst case scenario? What's the added cost to getting it down to 2 bananas? Like, even in this ridiculous scenario, that's not realistic, where everything fails, you know, and it's like, we're building a Fort Knox out of gold bricks itself to put this stuff. And you know, there is a hazard, but we know how to manage that hazard. We know how to shield it. And that's why there's not been any deaths associated with stored civilian nuclear waste. And so my question for him was, okay, so you want to spend $26 billion on this deep geologic repository. To me, that seems like a huge misallocation of societal resources. If you can do it for 2 billion, right? Then what can you send every, I know, high school age kid in Canada who wants to go to university to school to get a higher education? Like, what can you, like, we're just shoveling.
Or in America, where we don't even have like guaranteed
bills.
healthcare for like kids. Like, can we just get some kids some healthcare? You know,
right,
it's like,
right. But instead, it's and for me, again, it all comes back to this key point. And James Conca hits on this a lot around nuclear waste, which is that it's you find the best geology, and the geology is the barrier. And you know, we've got the WIP, which has got even crazier stats. But in Ontario, the rock we're looking at, it takes 1 million years for water to move a meter. The water has to get through all those engineered barriers, dissolve a ceramic fuel pellet in an anoxic environment. You know, that water needs to, you know, dissolve it, carry those radioisotopes. And if that water takes 1 million years to move a meter, you're done.
Yeah.
You know, we're thinking about waste on a civilizational time scale, which can be scary. But we're not keeping it on the surface in canisters. We're putting it in a geological formation, and we're looking at geological time scales. And we've made a mountain out of a molehill.
But I'll still push back. And I know I've diverted the conversation a little bit, but this is something I want to talk to you about anyway. I think it's a fun discussion
for sure.
Publicly. I'm still going to push back on this idea that it's a hazard. I'm willing to admit it's toxic, but like, so like the kitchen table in front of me right now, like I treated those shelves up there, like the chemicals that I treated them with are toxic, and we feel comfortable throwing them in a landfill because we're not worried about people like going onto a landfill and shoving the chemicals into their mouth. And that's also what we need to do if it was with nuclear waste too. Like you would need to eat it. Like you would need to walk up to a pile of nuclear waste somewhere and just eat it. I don't even care what geology it is. If you just throw it in any landfill and just pile some dirt on top of it, it is not going to be a hazard, period, end of story, just like we do with like all of the toxic chemicals that don't have a half-life, that last infinity long. Like we just throw them in a landfill and we assume people aren't going to walk up to it and shove it in their mouths. And that's good enough.
I can always trust you to kind of push it a little further down the road, right? But...
Hey, dude, my middle name is Shift the Overton Window.
No, I feel you. You know, you said something that struck me earlier, which is, you know, just the failure of imagination within the sort of nuclear sector's communications. And, you know, this was something that I came up with for our most recent petition, because we're talking again about this whole sector being left out of the green bond framework. And you know, part of this podcast, the beauty of this journey is, you know, I'm not an economist. I have a very, very poor understanding of economics, but I'm able to have cultivated some relationships now. And I basically have a special economics advisor that I can send a text to at 2 a.m. and usually he gets back to me and can explain complex stuff to me. And, you know, because economics is a weakness of mine, I've had him on about 8 times now. But, you know, understanding the way in which we've built our civilizational infrastructure, like that which makes us a modern advanced society, is that infrastructure. And we've talked about that on the podcast with this whole kind of getting very back to basics or first principles of, you know, these are stored energy conversions, you know, the bridges, the sewers, the roads, the water systems, the power plants, et cetera. But they were really financed and built with bonds. And so the idea of leaving nuclear out of a bond at a time when you're if you're taking climate change seriously, going to need to do a generational undertaking, a war mobilization type undertaking to build new infrastructure. Cutting the most effective tool for that action out of your bond financing is a big problem. So I was generating some arguments around this, and I was, in Canada we have the oil sands, which are sort of our climate bête noire. It's bitumen that we have to inject high temperature steam to loosen up. We have to just dig up the sand, and it's not a great EROEI source, and it's only viable when oil's at, I think, $70 a barrel or something like that. But all that to say, that's kind of the dark sort of side of our climate impact in Canada. And that's why, as an OECD country, our emissions have really not done much. The oil sands went up, our nuclear powered coal phase in Ontario brought emissions down on one side of the country as oil sands went up. And so we've sort of held it level thanks to nuclear, largely. But I wanted to look at, what's kind of the opposite of the oil sands in terms of a resource extraction program that is displacing emissions or reducing emissions. And I was like, well, let's look at the Canadian uranium sector.
Yeah.
And so globally, the nuclear fleet offsets 2 gigatons of CO2 per year. For reference, all of humanity puts out 50 gigatons per year. 50 is a really good number to know. So 2 is offset by nuclear. With the paltry amount that we do, we should do so much more. But Canada's contribution to that, the most recent numbers I could find from 2013 are about 13%. And so we offset domestically and internationally 260 megatons of greenhouse gas emissions. And that happens to be 1/3 of our annual national emissions as a pretty heavy polluter from a carbon position relative to our population. Canada, we're a smallish country. So we offset 1/3 of our annual national emissions with our uranium sector, yet so much of this sort of financial game of carbon offsets is, well, I won't cut down this forest, so I'm going to offer you some carbon trading credits. Oh shit, climate change, and it burned down because we didn't manage the forest well or whatever, because of forest fires. There goes the carbon, right? But we have a physical asset that's like, that has a demonstrated ongoing track record of decarbonization, and we don't recognize it as a country. And the sector that does it didn't do that math. It was some random doctor who's become a podcaster, who's become obsessed with energy and climate change, who's doing these numbers on the back of an envelope, writing a petition. Like we live in a strange world.
Yeah, I want to come back to the bonds for a second to understand what you distinguish between the one that was successful and the one that's not being categorized appropriately by the government. But before we get there, I just wanted to just hone in on a little bit of that math. So that's like 25 times. All we need to do is produce 25 times as much nuclear to totally negate everything else, right? And so to me, I'm thinking, okay, so everywhere that you see a nuclear plant, and this is for all of energy, not just electricity, if you just built 25 buildings there, and by the way, there's only 450 such places, okay, so build 25 buildings, which does not seem like an astronomical number of buildings. Like if anyone goes to any city that's doing some construction, like even just like DC, I can see 25 cranes on the skyline easily. I'm sure in cities in Canada, it's the same way. 25 buildings. You see a nuclear plant, build 25 buildings, boom. We have totally eliminated all carbon emissions on planet Earth. Now, granted, I'm simplifying, but like that's a good way to like visualize that it actually doesn't take that much stuff when you're using nuclear to displace all emissions.
It's bonkers. Yeah. I mean, and some emissions, of course, are not displaceable even.
Right. Exactly.
Some exaggerated electricity, but yeah, I mean, conceptually, that's a very interesting thought exercise. I hadn't done it myself.
So let's come back to that bond framework again. Just help me understand. So if there was this one green bond that was made by a public, not public, a private entity or pseudo public private entity, and it was 5 times oversubscribed. I'm playing a little devil's advocate here. Why do we need government to create a green bond framework that includes nuclear? Why can't just companies just do it?
I mean, companies can, and Bruce Power did. They consulted with a sustainable finance consulting firm or a bank that approved them, that kind of said, yes, you are virtuous enough, but they didn't get the deep green. They got a light green rating.
Oh, I didn't realize.
Which meant a higher interest rate on the capital that was borrowed. Wind and solar is the I'm forgetting which kind of greens, but wind and solar is the ultimate green, right? And so they qualify for the lowest
this is like
lowest cost capital.
This is like softcore porn for the environmentalists, like 50 Shades of Green.
Yes, exactly. So I mean, there is a route there, which is exciting for sure within the private side. I mean, governments have a reputation, earned or not, for being, reliable in terms of paying back their debts, being able to finance those debts, and so they're able to offer, a AAA rated bond, which gets you basically the lowest interest rate. And for me, it's really relevant because you look at, well, can the private sector just do this? Well, I mean, EDF, which is a government associated company, obviously, and owns the UK nuclear fleet. I mean, Hinkley Point, apparently 2/3 the cost of that project is the cost of capital, which I believe is 9 or 10% interest rates. If they could be doing it for 2.2, 2.5, what does that do to the cost of that nuclear plant? Right. And with cost being such a concern in this day and age, for me, and especially learning, like, well, again, bonds built our country, they built our infrastructure, and we're on this, this in Canada, the numbers are really staggering. In order to just double the size of our electricity grid, which wouldn't get us all the way there, but would do, put a dent into transportation and buildings, heating, that sort of stuff. We need to double it, and it's the equivalent of building 96 new large Candu reactors. We've built 24 in the history of the country, and we built 20 in Ontario in 20 years. And that wasn't with the imperative of like, shit, we need to build for climate. It was a more practical reason. Shit, we need to build so we don't have blackouts because of a lack of generating capacity. But it was bonds that financed those sorts of things. So I didn't have an appreciation for the importance of bonds. And I mean, this green bond that the government's issuing is only for $5 billion. It's their first offering. It was oversubscribed 2 times, not the 6 times that Bruce was. But they're saying that it's going to be 10 billion, year after year after year, probably going forward. And so just vital that nuclear is on there. And yeah, I'm happy to, yak a bit more about, how that sort of advocacy went. But it brought home to me, when you're talking about, okay, let's build 25 more of those buildings in every site. Well, how the hell do we pay for it? How do we mobilize the capital to do that? And I mean, if I'm not well versed in this, if you have stuff to add here more from the sort of private side, I'm very interested. There's certainly political parties that say, hey, we're a no new spending candidate here. Tell us how to do this without spending any public money. I don't have an answer for that, but if you do, I'd love to hear it.
No, listen, I think bonds are a great mechanism. I think that they, properly align incentives. A lot of these government bonds, are crafted with like long-term investment thinking in mind. And that's something that nuclear happens to play well into. You put a lot of money up front, but then it pays back, really well over a very long period. I mean, these are assets that last a long time. And so you get the steady payback stream over that period of time. So but I think, private capital, public capital, I think we can put it all to work. No, I'm all for it. I'm all for investing in more nuclear. It only makes sense if we can get the construction period down, if we can get the costs per plant down. I think that market forces, will take over and make it the dominant energy source. But a cheaper cost of capital is one way to create that cycle of ever reducing costs as you build more and more of the same thing.
Absolutely. So I mean, the petition really took off, as I was saying. This whole concept of building a block, building a critical mass, without abusing the metaphors too much. It happens accidentally now, and usually when I say no pun intended, I really have to think through a pun, and it is always intended. So when they happen accidentally, it's great. But anyway, we got a lot of signatures on this petition, and again, I think there's just been a sea change in attitudes towards nuclear that I've seen since I became interested in it and started reading into it about probably 2017, 2018. And it's practicalities that I think make nuclear really thrive, and things like energy crises, skyrocketing fossil fuel prices, geopolitical thunderstorms, right? OPEC crisis, right? I mean, obviously there's nuclear going before the OPEC crisis, but that was a serious, okay, let's put the pedal to the metal here, particularly for net importers of fossil fuels like France or island nations, et cetera. So it's only natural. And I mean, I do find this quite ironic that, when fossil fuel prices or when energy prices are high, all of a sudden there's big trouble in renewables land. And there's a renaissance for nuclear. And when fossil fuel prices are rock bottom, as they've been since the sort of fracking revolution, it was renewables time. So it's interesting.
It's so true. It almost makes me question, like, does what we do even, like, are we actually creating change, or are we actually a product of change that was already occurring? Like, has there been an opportunity for us to, find a voice in the nuclear industry, because the tides were already turning? There was already like instability in the power markets over these last few years that drove us to the sector, or that drove interest in the sector, including us. We didn't even realize that we were all just like part of this thing that was going to happen anyway. And then like things just keep on culminating. It's like, the increase of renewables leads to energy instability, leads to higher prices, maybe even leads to, Putin, seeing an opportunity. And then, maybe it was all fated to happen. We're just along for the ride.
I think in a lot of ways that's true. I mean, the sort of like great man theory of history is I think pretty patently easy to poke holes in, especially when you're like become an energy determinist like you and I do. There's certainly a role for the personalities that come along, these kind of accidents of history, to rise up and be.
And I wouldn't give it up for the world. I mean, this has been, I don't know about you, this has just been such a fun, it's, can be stressful times, totally. But I think
there is I think it's Milton Friedman, if I'm getting it right. And I think that's actually where I'm borrowing this battle of ideas framing from. But I think he talks a lot about when a crisis presents itself, all of a sudden it's like there's a bunch of sheets of paper on the ground, and policymakers are running around with their tails up and just grabbing at what's there and picking up ideas. And so it's been vital, when times were hard, that there were folks like yourself or like myself that are putting these ideas out there, making them available, so that people go, shit, crisis, what are some good ideas? What can we do? And that's what's been really, really exciting for my organization, Canadians for Nuclear Energy. We're a group of there's no paid staff, we're all volunteers. And what's so amazing about that is, I mean, talking to some of my venture capital people, when they talk about this like startup phase where things are super lean and super efficient, and they're comparing that to kind of government bloat, and I come from more of this kind of lefty progressive thing, but like within our organization, because we're so, we have like not much money in the bank, shall we say, and it's mostly coming from our members. There's a lot of passion there, and there's the beautiful thing about this nuclear advocacy world is there's just such smart, intelligent people with such a diverse array of backgrounds and economics and running. Like we have a former systems operator, like control room supervisor, the guy who was like turning up this power plant, dialing down that one, keeping the whole system going. We have obviously doctors, engineers. We've got a lot of great expertise, and we've developed a lot of really, really bold, strong talking points that the industry would never make. And so being able to turn those into memos and briefs and present those to, I'd love to get to all the political parties, because, as we say, Canadians for Nuclear Energy, the best climate solutions belong in every party. But it's great being able to kind of seed these ideas in from the back benches, and then all of a sudden find myself speaking to the Minister of Defense for my country, and saying, I'll get you a memo next week on how this is relevant to you.
Amazing. I mean, so you're really interacting at the absolute highest levels of government at this point. It's unbelievable. You can tell us just a little bit story about recently how they reached out to you, or how they got a hold of you for this.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I didn't know this, but we are a tier 1 nuclear country, so it does make sense. The two main political parties, the Liberals and Conservatives, I hate making kind of Canada-US comparisons. The Democrat-Republican comparison doesn't really do it justice at all, but they're party of the sort of center and a party of the center right, I'd say, not as extreme as our neighbors to the south, but both of them have nuclear caucuses. With
us too.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know if that's true, but I know that there's pro-nuclear people on both sides.
But are they organized as a caucus that meets every month to talk about nuclear issues?
Probably not. I don't actually. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. I'm in DC, but I'm actually not that well versed in what legislative happening.
I mean, I was impressed by this, and I think they've sort of gone moribund for a while and had like bursts of energy where they've been meeting more regularly. But certainly there's peaked interest, and so there's a group of ranges between about, 15 and 25, I believe, in each party that are part of these caucuses and interested and meet on a regular basis to discuss these issues. And we'll be doing, plant tours and things like that soon, which I'm really excited about.
And you're going to be part of that? You're going to be leading those, or you're going to be like?
I definitely want to be. I want to be a part of it. I want to visit. I'm not leading them. I don't have those kind of connections. But I did do the tour of Bruce Power that I did was.
But even if you're not leading them, in some ways you're going to be considered.
Yeah, I gave a key.
People are going to be asking you, even just as this like outside person who's like not working for the power plant, like, hey, Chris, what should I think about this? Like,
yeah. No, I went. The first tour that I did, the first nuclear plant I toured was, start big, right? Start with the world's largest operating nuclear facility, Ontario boy here. But it was with labor unions and our left political party, the Social Democrat, like New Democratic Party, who tend to be pretty skeptical of nuclear, because being a party of the left with a lot of roots in sort of anti-war activism, and that boomer generation became sort of de facto anti-nuclear energy. And so it was the nuclear power workers unions who I've been really reaching out to and building relationships with. Again, speaking about that, developing that critical mass and mobilizing that sector of 76,000 people. They were very interested in bringing in these, politicians who have roots, their political parties have roots in trades unionism, and saying, hey, come have a look at the last bastion of healthy union culture, of these jobs that we're nostalgic for, the kind of manufacturing jobs of like the 50s, 60s, 70s, where, you could support a single family, or you could support a family on one wage. You can have a car, a house, you could send your kids to school, or if your kids wanted to come work at your work. From my experience, from what I've been able to research, it is kind of the last bastion of those kind of jobs, that kind of employment, and those kind of vibrant, healthy communities, with a substantial tax base, where there's jobs for everybody. It's because it's not just, operators, it's all the tradespepeople, it's the paramedics, they have a fire department on the site, they've got all sorts of stuff, right? And so being at that tour, I gave a sort of a keynote to those left-wing political party members, but also there were a number of trade unions that were invited who are not nuclear and also tend to be quite anti-nuclear, which is horrible, but they learned so much, and it was really amazing, seeing eyes really open and jaws hit the floor, as people sort of really could identify with their values. And I made that sort of that line about the best the best climate solutions, or the best clean air solutions, or the best just transition solutions belong in every party. But I think that is something really unique about nuclear. I'm writing an op-ed right now on that theme. And we have the Conservative Party in Canada, and I'm making the pitch that nuclear is the ultimate economic stimulus, especially in Canada. 96% of our supply chain is here. We have independent economic analysis that demonstrates that every dollar you spend on Candu, you get $1.40 back in GDP. Wow. Like there's nothing like that. And particularly when you start looking at the alternatives of buying, polysilicon solar panels from China or wind turbines, it looks like Europe can't build wind turbines economically anymore.
But hold on, this is like the strongest argument. Then, like, I didn't even realize that there was this positive, economic feedback loop when it came to nuclear. Plus, you get the clean air benefits. Plus, you get like the long-term job security benefits, not just even like the short-term economic. Like, okay, come on. Now it's almost too good to be true. I mean, I always knew it was too good to be true, I always knew it wasn't too good to be true. It's just too good. But now it's like doubly, triply too good, because I hadn't even thought about that with your localized supply chain. That is ridiculous.
I mean, and it's very. I mean, it was Noah Redberg who brought this to my attention, right? Just like how special Canada is as a pretty small country that developed a viable reactor design. There's we've had dozens and dozens and dozens of attempts and at building these things, and we've ended up with 4 or 5 major pressurized water, boiling water reactors, et cetera. And like the Candu, the pressurized heavy water reactor, we invented that, we have it, we still run it, we're refurbishing it. And yes, and because we are a tier 1 nuclear nation with the richest uranium ores in the world, we own the whole supply chain. We don't need to enrich, but it's incredible.
That is
so.
It's so wild. So it's like, okay, so I remember back, I've recently found out that back in American politics, there are politicians who ran where their primary campaign was run on this, like, let's go 100% nuclear. I think like JFK, maybe even a few others. they're like, let's build 1,000 nuclear plants in America.
Yeah.
That was the leading campaign slogan. So, I mean, do you see a future where like a head of state in Canada could run on that platform?
You know, it's interesting at COP26 in Glasgow, our Prime Minister Trudeau was asked about nuclear energy. And he gave a very typical answer, which was, we're doing wind. He wasn't asked about wind. We're doing solar. He wasn't asked about solar. You know, climate change is a big deal. It's a big challenge. We got to have a lot of options. We got to keep them on the table. And, you know, nuclear is on the table, probably, maybe, could, sort of, should, maybe, if.
I hate that.
You know, that was the answer.
Oh,
and that was the answer. And I mean, so when I was talking to like his colleagues, and again, you know, I don't come at this from a partisan angle. I mean, Robert Bryce, I think, says it really well, where he says, you know, I'm not a member of any of these parties. I'm a member of the disgusted party. You know, all joking aside, I mean, you know, I'm able to, again, come in friendship to all. I have differences with all of these parties. You know, I'm a very particular person. I've never been happy in any sort of religion and any sort of ideologic formation, never been able to label myself politically. I find it interesting. I think each of them have a distinct sort of moral set of taste buds that guide them. But it's interesting being able to make that pitch. Like I was saying, the conservatives, it's around economy. The liberals, I'd say it's, you know, really around climate change and showing them, you know, they are a party that's put in place a price on pollution, carbon tax. You know, they talk a big game, and they're I think talking with the local MPs, they're genuinely interested. But there's not that kind of energy literacy. And I can't say I blame them, because we're just so energy literate as a society. Okay, but if you are like, and this is the kind of thing, like if you do get interested in climate and policy, then you've got to spend a few years understanding energy and digging into it. But that's not been the culture. And we're not a political class of engineers and scientists, because I think those folks just can't stand the kind of inertia of politics. So it ends up being a different sort of group of professions that enters into Western politics anyway. But they're thirsty for it. They're genuinely hungry for it, genuinely interested. And I was expecting a lot of hostility, because I had confronted their team member, right? Their Minister of Environment and Climate Change. And it was a pretty edgy little, you know, media hit with him in Glasgow. I think I embarrassed him. And he would never have agreed to sit down for that kind of an interview, but just managed to catch him on the fly. But, you know, again, I don't come trying to destroy their political party. I come bringing ideas to try and help them develop the best the best policies possible. And it's being warmly received. And especially it's like folks who have not thought about it so deeply. Like if you try and make these arguments on like energy Twitter, or within the nuclear sector, there's a real stark sense of what's possible and what's not, right? But because these politicians have not thought so deeply about these issues, they're really open. It was, for me, I was like, this is really beautiful.
Well, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty amazing to hear that there's that opportunity. But you also dodged my question a little bit, just like you accused the politicians of. I wanted to hear it from you. Do you think that a head of state can run on a platform of 100% nuclear?
Not yet. Of course not yet, Brett.
Why not?
But I mean, eventually.
Why not? Why not? Don't you think so? Okay, because like you went to this whole like energy literacy thing, but I'll take a different stance, because like I don't think that like someone needs to be like a rocket scientist to say, hey, let's go to the moon. Like I think I think it is literally just the being bold part, having a grand vision part that resonates with people. I actually don't even think it matters what that like vision actually is. But if someone is willing to like throw their reputation behind something with such like passionate conviction, I think that would sway voters. And it has been done before on nuclear. Heads of state have run on 100% nuclear platform before. And man, wouldn't if education, if energy literacy like was something that, I mean, obviously is something that needs to be done, wouldn't that be the greatest opportunity? Like, remember how like, it's like when Yang in America ran on this universal basic income, he came out strong for it. Nobody knew what universal basic income was, but he was able to not only educate everybody. Everyone's like, now, where's my $1,000? Where's my $1,000, Yang? Like, so he was able to not only educate, but he was able to even shift the political dynamic to be more in favor of it. I think I'll put my opinion out there. I think someone could run a presidential or prime minister campaign on 100% nuclear and use that as the opportunity to re-educate everyone on like what nuclear actually is. And I think they benefit from it politically.
Right. I mean, I have to agree with you. The politicians that really craft their campaign carefully to, we're going to win this election. We're going to meet people where they're at. We're going to develop our completely unimaginative policy around what people think is safe and want. No, it's folks like Andrew Yang that bring these big, bold ideas and bring people along with them. That's what speaks to me personally. That's what I find interesting, and that's what's necessary, because we need change. And there's a great Mark Twain quote that says, this is more about needing to shift politicians, changing them every few years. Let's just share it on the side. It's not really relevant. It just came into my mind, but politicians, like diapers, need to be changed regularly and for the same reason. Anyway, but in terms of, that question of like, we're going to go to the moon. I mean, that resonated because of the space race, right? Because of that anxiety that they were being overtaken by the Soviet Union.
And look what the Soviet Union's doing with energy right now. Sounds like a great opportunity to say, let's go 100% nuclear.
Yeah. It's a great opportunity for Canada, certainly, to try and step into the vacuum of the decimation of Rosatom and the decimation of their fuel fabrication. We're a tier 1 nuclear nation. We don't enrich uranium, but we could and we should. And do
you guys think about exporting the Candus? Is that on the table?
It's been done, right? It's been done. I mean, China, Korea, Romania, India,
Argentina, I think also.
Yeah. I mean, Candu needs to be resuscitated. We are keeping our fleet alive, with the exception of Pickering and Gentilly in Quebec, with these refurbishments, which, I like to shit on the West a lot in terms of nuclear, but I'm really coming to understand that Canada is actually decently positioned. The largest infrastructure project in our country, $26 billion, is refurbishing a good chunk of our Candu fleet. And so we're building, we have heavy forging. We're building new steam generators. Apparently we're banging out 8 steam generators a year from one factory in Cambridge, Ontario.
Where do they go? And where do they go to?
Those are going to Bruce, I believe.
Oh,
Darlington.
Okay.
I think all those ones are going to Bruce. Yeah, there's a lot of steam generators per and Pickering's even more. It's like 12 steam generators per reactor.
Well, even better.
But I mean, I didn't know that. I mean, I remember when I was learning about the preconditions of the Mesmer build-out in France, and I think it's the Chalouse plant that was banging out reactor pressure vessels, and I forget the numbers they were doing per year, but it wasn't that far off from what we're doing here. And that's always been, from, again, this outsider, and I want to really bring and this beginner's mind and this humility, which I think is very much I owe to the world, given that I'm not an expert in these areas. But my sort of common sense vibes here is, why Candu is so important for Canada is that the West, in its at its aborted renaissance of the early 2000s, got obsessed with this idea that we were going to innovate and come up with a new fancy design which is going to solve all our problems, when we had a completely atrophied nuclear construction workforce. We're going to go out on a limb and try something we've never done before, right? Whereas in Canada, because of these refurbishments, we're swapping out all the internals of our reactors. We may not be that good at pouring nuclear concrete and rebar. We'll find out about that. That stuff, hopefully we can bring in some expertise to make that happen. I mean, from what I hear, if you make a fuck up, it's a pretty big fuck up, and you got to tear stuff back up. But all that aside, Canada is very well situated to be a little bit conservative here, to build a reactor that we're intimately familiar with, both in operations and in refurbishment, which is, I think, a good chunk of that construction. And so, to me, it's the lowest risk investment to make it, for Canada. That being said, I just spent at a 24-hour intensive with our friend Khalif Kalmetz of Fermi Energia, and he's very sold on the SMR model and more of the sort of like private sector model. And it is interesting. Canada does have a huge opportunity, being a first mover on with this BWRX 300. There's interest in Europe and around the world to build more of these units, and we may be able to capture some of that supply chain because we were a first mover. So what I'm trying to convey to Canadian politicians is that there's a huge amount of opportunity here, but we need to bet big and be bold. We need to signal with things like our green bond framework that we're serious about nuclear, that it's a safe place for private capital to come and stimulate this sector, our ultimate economic stimulus, to up our share of world uranium, to build Candus here, to build SMRs here, to export them. We're actually in a decent position, but it is going to take serious, bold leadership. And when Trudeau is asked about nuclear at next year's COP, he needs to come out swinging and say, absolutely, Canada is a tier 1 nuclear nation. we achieved the greatest decarbonization in North American history with our Ontario coal phase out. We offset a third of our emissions with the uranium that we mine. We're doing more because we're helping Europe become energy independent, as they have committed to eliminating Russian energy imports. Canada's a small nation, but we're punching above our weight. And we're gonna help out our allies in Europe in this way. Like, that's the kind of wind I'm trying to blow into the sails of these politicians, and I think they're excited about it.
Who's carrying out those refurbishments right now?
Yeah, I mean, so there's 4, all the units at Darlington are being refurbished, so that's OPG. And then
but which is the engineering firm that's actually doing the work?
I'm sketching this, but BWXT is doing the steam generators in Cambridge.
Okay, they're doing some, okay, but yeah, I wonder.
There's a huge number of contractors that are involved, but
okay, yeah, because I'm wondering, it's like, because if you can refurbish, that means every part inside and out of that Candu reactor, right? Which means that the engineering know-how of like how to put these things together is out there, sitting in the hands of like a private engineering firm or many private engineering firms in Canada.
Yeah.
It's just like, come on, like,
active.
Yeah, and like, don't you want more business? Like, okay, so like, now say that you can build a bunch, you've done the refurbishment, you've gathered the expertise, you're clearly trusted with nuclear regulators, with utilities. So now, brag about that expertise, and just start selling these things everywhere.
And why stop refurbishing with just Darlington and Bruce? And we have a very exciting report we're about to drop on Pickering.
Tell me what's going on with Pickering, because this is infuriating.
It should be. I'm glad you feel that way. Yeah. I mean, so Pickering is one of our crown jewels. We have 3 of them in Ontario. We have the Bruce site, the Darlington site, and the Pickering site. And these were built at a time when we really knew how to build nuclear well. And we had this idea down that you pick a design, you standardize it, and you build a whole bunch of units on one site. So Pickering is 8 reactors. Bruce is 8 reactors. Darlington is 4. We were supposed to build another 4. And yeah, basically, Pickering, 8 550 megawatt Candu reactors. And the plan is to shut it all down 2024, 2025. It's been extended. It was supposed to be shut down in 2018, but I think the electricity operator, and the new government, they came and put their heads together and said, okay, this doesn't make any sense. There was a great Ontario Chamber of Commerce report that looked at this, and there's 7,600 jobs, 3,000 direct, 4,600 indirect full-time equivalent jobs on the line. Huge tax base, and obviously it's what gives us our climate leadership. With this one plant closing, Canada will lose all of its emissions reductions progress it's made since 2005. Right, 8 megatons. We haven't made much progress, again, because of the oil sands, and we haven't done a very good job as a country. But we're going to lose it all with the closure of one nuclear plant. Closing it will add 1%. Will increase our annual emissions by 1% as a whole country. Just closing one piece of infrastructure, one plant, right? And to make it intelligible to the politicians, I tell them, this plant, when it closes, the independent systems operator confirms it will be replaced almost entirely by natural gas. Not wind, not solar, because you're swapping out stable generation for something that's stable and reliable. It'll be gas. That's the equivalent of 8 million transatlantic flights per year. And that seems to get through to politicians because they fly a lot, right? To go back and forth to parliament and whatnot.
Wow. Yeah, it's wild. I mean, it's there's no excuse for closing it down. That's just too crazy. Especially,
so, I mean, the excuses, and it's interesting because I want to like understand the decision makers, and there's a lot of inertia to making these decisions, and the variables change. And it was around 2010 when they decided they had a plan. It was, it's been approved. So we know it's technically possible. There's an EA that's been approved for it. The regulators signed off on it
to continue
to refurbish it, but OPG decided not to. And they did in an environment where climate concern wasn't as intense, where natural gas was seen as a, pretty squeaky clean transition fuel. I mean, certainly all the environmental groups were funded by natural gas at that point and singing its virtues, and our own Ontario Clean Air Alliance was lobbying not for nuclear, but for gas to replace coal in Ontario. And the fracking revolution had started, so gas economics looked really good. There was a plan to build another nuclear build at Darlington site. So maybe you could say, well, this is an older reactor, we're going to close it down, open another spot. These were some of the decisions that were at play then. Of course, facts on the ground have changed dramatically. Gas has tripled in the States, and like, where's it going to go once the US is really focused on helping out its European allies get off
Sure,
of
yeah.
Russian fuel, right?
Yeah.
We weren't thinking so much about electrification back then, and the idea that we're going to need to double or triple our grid. So knocking 3,200 megawatts of reliable 90+% capacity factor generation off your grid, you know, as we talk about electrification, it's a huge step backwards. And, you know, as great as the SMR program is, we say it's one step forward for 10 steps backwards. You're adding 300 megawatts and you're retiring 3,000 megawatts.
It's like a concession prize. I mean, listen, I love the SMR stuff. I mean, we're involved in it, but it is like a kind of a concession if, you know, if that's like the whole nuclear policy of a country. Is like, oh, we're gonna just forget about the big ones. But we'll do just enough for you nuclear advocates to be happy. We'll give you some grants. We'll give you $1 million here and there. Just to keep the loudest voices, the loudest nuclear scientists, you know, just to keep them paid off. We'll let you work on some research projects. That's cute. Like, because that's really what it feels like.
It does. Yeah. Especially when you know, if you're serious, right? And I always talk about it's like we're speeding towards a brick wall of our climate commitments. In a car with no brakes, you know, because the commitments
we're accelerating
are completely unrealistic. And, you know, we have this emissions reduction plan that the government put out. There's been 10 governments that have put out emission reduction plans. 9 have done so far. All have failed. This is the 10th. And reading through it, it was astounding. I mean, A, it's not a lot of money that's being promised. And B, there just seems to be this fundamental confusion of energy sources with energy carriers. And it's like, well, we're going to have a hydrogen economy. And it's like, how are you going to make that hydrogen? You do realize that, you know, it's very energy intensive to make hydrogen, or we're going to use lots of carbon capture and storage. Well, you do realize that it takes a lot of energy to run the carbon capture machinery. And currently we run that by just burning more coal or more gas, right? Like, this is fundamentally about switching out, replacing fossil fuel services, right? Heat, electricity, but also reliability, abundance, you know, dispatchability, et cetera. And we need to replace it with a better source of energy, a more thermodynamically viable source of energy, right? We need to do that on at least a one-to-one basis, if not more, because, you know, things like carbon capture, things like, you know, hydrogen generation, these take more energy.
It allows the renewable people who hate nuclear to just totally, you know, anytime somebody says, well, what about these flaws of renewables or those flaws of renewables? They say, oh, well, hydrogen. Oh, well, we'll capture. Oh, well, yeah, natural gas just capture. Oh, hydrogen. And they get to shut down the conversation immediately and totally, instead of, you know, facing a harder conversation.
You know, and I think there's also this element where you get to sound a lot more sophisticated and solve a lot more problems and do a lot more modeling when you model something that's, you know, a Rube Goldberg machine,
right?
Than just saying, you know what, yeah, it's actually, I mean, this isn't simple. And I don't, you know, you talked about building 25 buildings. I mean, let's be clear, there were preconditions for the extraordinary build out, say in France, of those 45 reactors or 54 reactors in 15 years, or the way that the Chinese are looking like they're being able to build the Hualong 1 so quickly. I mean, that does take certain preconditions. That takes an
I say more to be illustrative,
heavy industry, et cetera, right? But I mean, certainly let's get going on that. Let's get building that. One of our current government slogans is "hard things are hard," and it's like, well, the hard energy path is hard, but you know, we got to get back on it.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I had a great conversation again with this wonderful Edgardo Sepulveda, I call him my senior economics advisor.
Oh, I listen to all those episodes. I mean, I listen to all your episodes.
It's great. Oh, we have a great one dropping tonight. And it's just a beautiful exploration of, you know, what we call sort of like the lost Amory Lovins decades, right? Where, you know, there was organic growth within our grids, you know, 5% per year, and there was demand. And then you start bumping up against, you know, things that are harder to electrify, right? And things that are not as viable to electrify, right? Like, you know, a fossil fueled car, an ICE engine is a pretty incredible thing, incredible range, et cetera. You know, heating, you know, from a strict perspective, especially with resistance heating, electricity is not a great use for it. We can do it in places where we have insane abundance, like France or Quebec with all of their hydro. But because we followed the Amory Lovins doctrine and we just stopped building new generation, or actually stagnated or decreased, we've become incredibly ill-equipped for the electrification challenges that we face now, where it's more of a inorganic growth, where it's a policy-based growth of we're doing this for the climate imperative. And we, you know, these politicians, they've grown up in those lost Amory Lovins decades. I guess we're going on like 5 4 or 5 decades now of that, of these entire policymakers' lives. They're not equipped with the tools and the policy capacities to even be imagining what's required for the build-up that we're talking about.
Wow.
That's staggering. And so I'm trying to bring that through, and without intimidating as well, because I'm talking to real fiscal conservatives, and I'm trying to make the play for, if you believe that the government has a very limited role to play, certainly most people, even on the extreme sort of fiscal conservative right, still think that the government should be running the military and national defense. But the way I'm trying to pitch it is that energy is and energy security.
Defense,
it is national defense, and it's
plus,
also.
I think your $1 in, $40 out argument is just amazing for the fiscal conservatives, also, right?
But what they're allergic to is the idea that it's going to be bond spending. That even though it is private capital, right? But the government is borrowing that and spending. It's it's not tax and spend, but it's borrow and spend. But what's the return it gives you? And the problem with our current green bond is that it's a bag of sort of feel good things. What can be funded. They're not things that necessarily give you a great return. And one of the concepts that, again, Edgardo helped me understand was this carbon abatement cost. And it's this idea of how to get the most bang for decarbonization buck. And I think it was Reiner Kurtz. He appeared on Robert Bryce's Power Hungry podcast, but he was looking at what's the carbon abatement cost for keeping New England's nuclear fleet online. It was $25 a ton. What's the cost of putting up a utility solar farm? It was about $300 a ton. What's the cost of rooftop solar? $800 a ton. So we need to optimize that dollar, right? Particularly coming out of inflationary spending on COVID responses and things like that. If we're going to rein things in fiscally, government still needs to spend, but they need to do it incredibly wisely. And we should be running those numbers. Those are numbers you can actually plug into a basic calculation.
I see. The carbon abatement cost, if I can paraphrase, is you're simply trying to find a metric by which to levelize. Like you're trying to find a common, there's a lot of crazy inputs, but this is like a common metric that, you can compare a variety of different energy sources.
You can find the variables, plug them in. Yeah.
That's cool. That's great.
And so if I was designing that, in what we call, I guess, what is it, like a technologically neutral, there's a better word for it, agnostic kind of frame. It's like, well, let's just plug in those numbers and see, and obviously there's tons of ways to manipulate numbers, and there's LCOE and things like that. But carbon abatement cost is I think a pretty, again, there's assumptions that will go into how those numbers play out. There's lies to analyze and statistics, and then there's modeling and other things as well. But I think the core message for these more fiscally conservative politicians is, this is an area of vital national interest. As Isaac Orr says, energy is a secret ingredient in everything. We're going to be eating a lot of pain here with, food prices that are already higher than the 2008 economic crash, which destabilized much of the Middle East. We're
that's what I'm worried about.
Times and high prices, and
that's what I'm worried. I'm worried. I'm worried that with all these forces that you just mentioned, that at some point people will just say, "Oh well, climate change isn't our problem now, because we've got food prices to deal with. We've got inflation to deal. Hey, we got inflation. People, we're heading into a recession. Oh, people, and you want me to worry about climate change?" Like that argument, people were thinking that with this whole, we have 12 years. Remember that whole, we have 12 years to really right the ship. I think they think that, if that number keeps counting down, people are just going to get more and more urgent, and then finally it'll kick things into gear. But what I think is going to happen, as that number clicks down, other world forces are just going to become more of an issue. And then people are just this climate change thing, they'll find another way to rationalize around it. Oh, it wasn't that bad, or it's too difficult, or the next generation will be living inside a virtual reality, so they don't need the environment anyway. But I can't predict it. I can't predict it. I don't think anyone can predict it. But in 5 years or in 10 years, it'll seem inevitable that people, here are the reasons why they just gave up on climate change. You know what I'm saying?
Here's some thoughts I have. I think that we've been living a very easy decade. It's not been easy for everybody, but capital's been very cheap. Energy's been extraordinarily cheap. And we've had the luxury to be climate concerned. And unfortunately, we've had the luxury to really fuck up our climate response and not do things in a very effective manner. That's going to change dramatically. As you're saying, there's other imperatives that come into play. And we see that, in less developed countries, climate is not their organizing principle around which they're steering government policy or economic activity for very real and understandable reasons. But as someone who's a real climate hawk, it's been interesting coming to terms with the fact that really getting energy wrong within a very short term, we're talking years to a decade, its proximate effects, the human suffering, the deaths, and we're going to be seeing some of that, I think, because of the food stresses of a badly managed approach to energy are greater than climate change in the short term, right? Like, we're not talking 2200 here, we're talking 2030. If we really, if we really to follow the prescriptions of these very simplistic thinkers, who basically equate fossil fuels to cigarettes without understanding that we truly live in a fossil fuel civilization. I mean, look at Václav Smil, look at fertilizer, steel, and cement. Those are all critically dependent on fossil fuels. If you don't have those ingredients, you don't have a civilization, you have mass starvation. And we're flirting with that. We're seeing that with the way that fertilizer prices are going. I mean, geopolitics aren't helping this at all, but just the energy crisis alone. You had Doomberg on 2 episodes ago. They wrote a great piece, Farmers on the Brink, which goes into this perfect storm of factors. Most of them are related to botched energy policy and a really simplistic way of thinking about fossil fuels. And for me, the takeaway is just like, it is a crime to be burning natural gas as baseload electricity. You're burning food, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think Alex Epstein says that, right? I mean,
or oil.
Natural gas
oil,
is the food of food.
Yeah.
So
crazy.
Yeah. So, I mean, I share that concern. And I think there's also the potential for real sort of populist backlash against these measures. And, I mentioned our government really prides itself on sort of putting a price on pollution, on carbon taxes. And I have to think through this more. And I know James Hansen, is a sort of carbon fee and dividend guy as well. To me, it feels, and again, I say this with humility, as not someone who's extraordinarily well versed in this, but my kind of gut reaction, my common sense reaction here is that it feels very sort of consumer politics. Like, well, they'll see the prices a bit high at the gas station, and they're going to do these calculations and think, hey, maybe next year I should get a Tesla, and And it's very slow moving. It's very sort of granular. Every person making their own. It's very market based, obviously, right? But when you're faced with the kind of challenges that we are and the response that's required, it's going to take a much higher level of organization than just individual consumer choices. So, I don't know. I'm inspired by, I think, what is possible. It's particularly within nuclear at this moment in time. Like, it's extraordinary seeing the UK with starting this. I'm not sure if it's a crown corporation, but a government entity, a vehicle to facilitate nuclear builds. Great British Nuclear.
Oh yeah, no, it's exciting. I was just on the phone with the British government a couple of days ago discussing this very thing. I remember.
Well, you tell that to me, because I just read a few stories on it, and I've been very excited about it. But I mean, what do you understand about it?
It's still being developed.
yeah, exactly.
I can tell you right now, it's they're still working out the exact specifics. But the urgency is high. Like from what I heard, and they're very serious. Like, this is like, right now, I feel like it's just a name, but it's a name with a lot of political capital and a lot of political momentum behind it. Mm-hmm. Even if it doesn't have the details of what the exact like government or corporate structure is going to be, they are deadly serious about this. What is it called? It's like the Great British Bake Off, but I guess Great British
Nuclear.
Great British Nuclear. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean,
no, it's exciting.
It's coming from a conservative government, right? But I think it shows you that when the rubber meets the road, and when energy security, when there's an energy crisis, that we will find a way, right? And there's so many excuses made for why we're not taking bolder action on climate and more bolder action with nuclear. And once there's a real rationale there, you see things happen quickly. And I think we're at the verge of seeing that happening across the world.
Yeah, it's so funny. Let me just continue on this Great British Nuclear point for a second, because I was going to critique, or at least offer a bridge between what you were saying and how I feel about things when it comes to what's going to allow for like the greatest scale up of nuclear possible. And I think the Great British Nuclear actually might be the perfect compromise, because I actually think that market forces can be used more effectively to like create huge scalable global change. And I think your point, if I understand it correctly, was no, you need some the power of a big government in the direction and like the tools and the force and the money and the infrastructure behind that to make that change. And I actually think that's what this Great British Nuclear thing might be. It might be like the love child of those two things. Yeah. I think it's going to be the power, the vision, the tools of the government, but it's going to be enabling private market actors to actually implement.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, it's this whole thing of you know, as you learn more, you're scaling the mountain, and the mountain just gets higher and higher the more complexity you read into it. And you know, hopefully the path you take is one of just greater and greater humility, despite gathering expertise, right? And so I find myself, you know, looking back at positions I held 6 months or a year ago and thinking just how incredibly naive I was then, and how naive I still am now, right? And so, I mean, I have my biases that I bring into this, but I find myself more and more open to, again, shedding tribal affiliations and just trying to figure out what the hell works and what is pragmatic and what is possible as well. Because certainly within my sort of political origins, a lot of it is, you know, make believe, and fantasy play, to be honest, in terms of the political left. It's I call it live action role play a lot of the time, right? Like,
yeah. Seriously. Okay. I also want to hear about your moves as, I mean, what do you have a name for yourself? Like, what do you call yourself right now? An activist, an advocate, a thought leader? Let's call you I'm just going to pick it. I'm going to say a nuclear thought leader.
All right.
Okay. As a nuclear thought leader, obviously, you know, Canada is your home, and you're gaining, you know, a huge amount of traction politically there. How are do you have ambitions do you have, okay, maybe you have ambitions, but do you have like a game plan to leverage your success in Canada at a global scale? Like, are you going to almost like create like a Chris Keefer playbook of what worked in Canada and start chopping that around? Or and then what are you going to create a bunch of like a little mini Chris Keefers around the world? Are you going to go around the world?
I've got one mini Chris Keefer, my boy, you know, but he'll be quite different than me, I'm sure. But yeah, you know, something that I think is really, really vital, is a tool to really, you know, speed up the education process for advocates, for politicians as well, right? And it's this idea of having a set of talking points, essentially, right? Meticulously crafted, you know, probably tweetable or Twitter length. And I'm drawing on some of the work of Alex Epstein here, but taking it in an obviously very different direction. But again, I borrow, I think Robert Bryce says this: amateurs borrow, professionals steal. So I'll steal that, and, you know, with my own imperatives and the differences that I have from Mr. Epstein. But this idea of having these carefully crafted talking points, which are hyperlinked to, you know, a background memo that really helps you understand that talking point in a lot of detail, so that when you deliver that talking point, you have this streamlined way of having some degree of expertise and the basis for it.
I love that concept of background memo for a talking point. That's awesome.
Yeah. And then maybe you hyperlink that memo even to some primary literature, but like, that's an enormous amount of work, and it takes really skilled people to pull it off. I've got some really, really skilled people. Shout outs to Dylan Moon in particular, my I shouldn't say the decoupled producer, and really real jack of all trades. But, you know, we've been working on these talking points for the podcast, and, you know, I put Dylan onto so many different tasks, and he does an excellent job. But it's you know, it's pretty ADHD in terms of, I've got this great idea, we should do this, we've got that great idea, and, you know, it's limited human resources being a pretty small little media enterprise. But we got to really put that to work, that concept, with the briefings and memos that we made for politicians. And so that's something I'm really excited about. And there's I remember hearing about this some time ago. There's a group called the Albert Einstein Institute, and I think they're kind of CIA affiliated. They've been involved a lot in the colored revolutions, like the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon, and I think maybe Maidan even. But they have a kind of playbook, a civil disobedience playbook, that they distribute to activists in countries with really, you know, repressive political scenarios. And it's a kind of playbook, as you were sort of discussing there, right? And that would include, say, if you're in a country where certain songs or music are banned, right? Some of the earlier iterations, I think, were written in like the 80s or 90s, when you still had those big, not Walkmans, what do you call those things? Like boom boxes, right? So you'd not a record player, no, like it's a cassette player, right? But you put the prohibited song on that, and you'd throw it in a garbage can on the street with the song on it, and it would play. And just the act of playing a banned song in a repressive country has a huge impact, right? Or I believe it was in Syria at the beginning of in the Arab Spring there. there's a huge fountain outside of the like internal security, internal police building, and some activists threw red dye into it, so it was a fountain of blood, right? And so it's this what I'm getting at is this concept here, right? A playbook. They took sort of best practices in terms of civil disobedience, and with particular focus on what works well within authoritarian countries, and they were able to arm activists to essentially overthrow those countries, and that happened to align quite nicely with the American imperial interest, and it was, obviously done in a pretty prescribed way. But all that aside, these are the things that sort of percolate through to me. So this idea of these kind of talking points, and this is not propaganda, right? This is stuff that's drawing on very, very high quality evidence. So it's a big project. It's going to take a lot of work. If anyone's listening that wants to help fund that, get in touch. But these are the kind of tools when you talk about sort of what do I feel like I have to offer more broadly. I mean, I come with a lot of humility because there's already a ton of people doing great work internationally, and we have a lot to learn from each other. There's of course the fabulous Stand for Nuclear network, which I think ties together almost all of those advocates in a great big happy family, and we're all constantly learning and interchanging. But
yeah, what an impressive group that is. I'm another, like, just like I sit back and I'm like a huge admiration of what you're doing. As I see like the news trickle in from the whole Stand Up for Nuclear crowd, I just sit back and just like it's like the favorite part of my night when I see some of those texts flying and see how much everyone's accomplished. I'm just like, these people, like someone, I can't wait till, yes, people are, I guarantee people are going to start writing books, now, but when someone writes the encyclopedia of what happened, I think it's going to just be awesome to read these stories.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's, we're like all these little grains of sand on a beach that are piling up into something. But I talk about it, in terms of looking at the, when you're in like a old school, like karate martial arts dojo or something, and there's like the scrolls of the various, they're not called gurus, whatever, the senseis, down through time. And
it's interesting like Star Wars, they have the old books that the Jedis read out of.
Yeah. So like I don't know, like the nuclear sensei is like, I think I'm sure there's figures that predate this. I'm thinking about William Seary at the Sierra Club president who basically made Diablo Canyon happen, right? Had the rational discussions to preserve another area of scenic beauty and to make a pragmatic decision about building Diablo Canyon, which ended up to be a great environmental choice for California. William Seary, folks like James Lovelock, the independent scientist and inventor, who very early on saw the case for nuclear, influenced folks like Stuart Brand, who in turn influenced Michael Schellenberger and Ted Nordhaus,
who in turn influenced us. It's like,
right. But it's interesting because it started, I think, as as some very lone voices, and intellectuals and theorists and philosophers, and then they had a lot of courage to come out and sacrifice reputation and really pay a heavy price, like thinking of folks like Mark Linus as well.
Yeah.
But they sort of created a space for others to sort of flourish and bloom, and for a movement to come together. And I think we're really seeing that transition from thought leaders and think tanks to an actual grassroots movement, chapters, organizations forming. Again, it's a David and Goliath battle, and we are the Davids, despite all of the perceptions of, you guys, because of the passion people see and how effective we are. They're like, you must be, just getting bankrolled by the nuclear industry. And it's just such a funny irony, because like the nuclear industry is I think Stand for Nuclear folks saved the Illinois plants and basically got nothing but trouble for doing it from the nuclear industry, right?
If people actually know, it is like, it's very frustrating, because even sometimes in like political discourse, like on very popular podcasts, I'll hear, like even on Joe Rogan or something, which I'm a huge fan of that podcast, I heard someone say something about, how, the nuclear advocates, how it's just, so equal. You've got like your nuclear bros against your environmental people, and like, the nuclear people must need so much money. And then like to be living this life and seeing like my friends like struggle financially, but like not have any money, like sacrificing, like making a lot of money, working for some big company, putting all their personal money into this nuclear advocacy, being turned away by the nuclear companies, seeing the nuclear companies invest money that's almost anti-nuclear. And then to hear that criticism in the public discourse, like I don't know. I don't want to say it frustrates me. I mean, it definitely frustrates me. It saddens me, but it also makes me think that like there's almost no point in having the conversation. Like there's almost no point in trying to articulate that to like the public audience, because clearly they're just swayed by the other argument like too easily. And this brings me back to like my take on like what we need to do. Like we just to me it's like, okay, well, we just need to make nuclear cheap and accessible, and and then build a shit ton of it and actually not care. Like I don't know, you tell me if you think I'm off on this, but like and maybe I'm just a little disenchanted, but my philosophy is we only need enough public support to get, whatever that quote unquote social license is, such that early efforts to build more nuclear don't get shut down. And if you can get those early efforts to build more nuclear working in a cost-effective, time-effective way, then you create this flywheel of market forces to take over the rest. And like, you never even have to win everyone over. You can let people lie about you, but just build, build 10,000 gigawatts. Just do it. You know what I'm saying?
I mean, it's interesting. When I was in Glasgow at COP26, we participated in some of the climate marches. And I remember like people coming up, who's paying you? And I was, in my doctor garb, and I'd pull up my medical ID and I'd be like, Medicare. I'm paid by the Ontario Health Insurance Program.
I love it. Well, you actually, out of everyone, have the most, oh God, I hate to say credible, but like the most easily to understand, because you have this full-time job as a doctor in Canada, it's like you're unimpeachable in terms of your credentials, more so.
Oh, and I am full-time, but I give up shifts every once in a while, like this trip to Ottawa. I mean, it cost me to do this for sure.
Right. Yes, I didn't mean to. Yeah.
I mean,
I mean, you're one of the people who sacrifice. Like when I was just ranting about all of my friends who have sacrificed so much. I mean, you're one of those people too. Like, no doubt.
Yeah. I mean, luckily it doesn't feel like a sacrifice, because I find it so interesting and stimulating. But God, yes, I would love for Team David to be much better resourced, because ultimately, like we have a world to win, right? We have a climate to win. We have human prosperity to win. But there was something else. I've been thinking a lot about this idea of kind of this virtuous cycle, like as I've been interacting with politicians in the media. And again, it's based on this sort of influencer model and this kind of paleo psychology. But as these bold talking points and memos start to infiltrate through the backbenches and work their way up through the political parties, and politicians start feeling a little more confident in what they're saying, as the media are it's been amazing. I've been on probably 15 or 20 talk radio shows in the last few months. We're starting to see really good print media coverage from newspapers which are traditionally anti-nuclear, and we're starting to see this shift. Like, you remember in the early 2000s when they had a discussion about climate change, journalism's all about being fair and balanced, so they bring on the climate change denier and the climate scientist, and it'd be balanced, right? And there's been, I think, that sense of needing to do that in the media up until very recently, of like, okay, we brought on Dr. Keefer, so we've got to bring on someone who's anti-nuclear. But I think the anti-nuclear folks, like their credibility is sort of coming to be seen as similar to that of the climate denialists. They're so out of sync with the science.
Yeah.
So that's really exciting to see. But there's this virtuous cycle, this interplay, right? That I see, the momentum that's building, where politicians are speaking more boldly, the public's starting to listen up, the media is starting to speak more intelligently about nuclear. These messages are, I think Dan Carling of Hardcore History, he talks about like intellectual contagion. And these ideas are, I mean, that's a terrible phrase to use. I'm just kicking myself as a doctor in the COVID pandemic talking about it that way. But there is a certain sort of like, let's stick to virtuous cycle. There's a virtuous cycle going on.
No, I know what you're talking about.
Take foot out of mouth. Yeah. But yeah.
Wow.
That's exciting times, Brett. It's exciting times. I would not have imagined being in this position personally, or just globally, in terms of all of the exciting things that are happening. It gives one optimism in what are otherwise pretty dark times. We just got to all work on being the best humans we can, because I have a cognitive bias to sometimes towards doom, towards thinking that COVID is going to be a lot worse than it ended up being, or a variety of other issues. And so I'm always trying to check that, do a little cognitive check.
So you're a natural,
I gotta say,
you're a natural pessimist, do you think?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. I'm a natural optimist.
Yeah.
Though, yeah, it's funny. It's funny. So are you like training yourself to think the other way. Sometimes I have to train myself, like from a business perspective, I have to like watch my own cognitive biases to make sure, like,
exactly.
I hedge risk.
Yeah, exactly. I'm on the other side. I need to do that, but I've folks like in that last podcast I did with Doomberg on this the perfect storm affecting world agriculture. I mean, it's concerning, and things don't get more serious than food shortages, right?
Oh, I know.
They really don't.
I know.
So,
That's always been my biggest. I mean, I started giving talks about this 3 years ago when I first got invited to like get on like the climate change talking circuit. My, you know, my biggest concern, I don't buy into the whole like, we're all gonna like be underwater type thing. Like that's, I mean, maybe, yeah, I mean, like eventually, sure. But like my biggest concern has always been a disruption to precipitation patterns. Like, and that can actually happen in the short term because it's more, because that it already happens. It's just a matter of like the frequency which it happens.
Right.
So, and you could see that affecting billions of people. But then like, I had some like recent optimism when, I have some friends that are in the like robotic agriculture space, and they're like, Bret, I get that you're a little concerned about food shortages, but let me just tell you like what we're doing from like a productivity per acre perspective. It's like wild. Like just in the US, we can feed the whole world, so like they tell me this stuff, but then, things start shifting again. And, and like we have what's going on with the Ukraine and the Russia wheat crisis. And I listened to your episode with Doomberg. Is it Doomberg or Doomberg?
Doom,
D-O-O-M. Doomberg, yeah. And I was also like a little, so now I got to go back to my agriculture friends and see what they think. But yeah, it's like,
yeah, it's great having smart friends to kind of bounce this all off of. And again, for someone who's a non-expert in that area like me to be able to take in a variety of different perspectives. Yeah, definitely. Hungry people become angry people pretty quickly, and I think those proximate impacts of climate change are so much more the social political ones. And
not only become angry people, it's also just it's just horrifying that we can let people starve given the amount of abundance that's available to us as modern society.
And that's
really disgusting that we can even, like as a society, that we can even allow for anyone across the planet to starve ever. Like this I don't understand why this isn't I mean, we've done a pretty good job, I think, overall, when you see how much calories we're able to deliver around the world, but we can do even better. And that should just be like, okay, can I riff with you for a second? So we got this like UN that's like totally defunct. Why don't we have like United Nations and I know that the UN has like these 17 target goals, or whatever, but like, I don't understand why we don't have like an individual worldwide agency, 180 countries get together, form this agency, and it's just all about like distributing calories across the world. Okay, like we're going to make like mission number one, make sure nobody starves and everyone has clean drinking water. And then like, okay, but like let's seriously focus on this and let's make sure it happens. And then after that, okay, now let's move on to like, okay, everyone has like basic medicine. And like, to me, it seems like that should be like a shared mission that we can bring together the world's countries for.
Mm-hmm. I mean, those are easy values to get behind, but I am seeing that optimist bias in you shining through quite bright there, Bret. I mean, for me, I think the stakes are, I've talked about this before as well, but this idea of kind of innovate or die, right? And the climate catastrophists are very capable of making their worst predictions come true if we follow their policy proposals, which are anti-innovation, which are, this romantic idea that we can go back to a simpler, better time, burn that biomass, farm using only methods, that are 200 years old, and just watch what's going to happen. And we're seeing that. I mean, look what happened with Sri Lanka when they, on a whim, shut off all synthetic inputs to their agricultural system.
Oh, I didn't know this happened.
Oh, it's wild. We're doing a show on it any day now, but check into that. But like ultimately, yes, we are going to need to innovate. There's always going to be new problems that will arise. We're going to create new problems with the technologies that we develop. We're going to have to solve them with new technology. It's a wheel that is forever rotating forward, and we really did the inertia behind that, the billions of people that depend on that innovation and that process are there. So that's this ideologic battle of ideas again, which we really need to win. And it's just such a shame spending such a large amount of my time in a rearguard action fighting, the anti-nuclear people or the anti-biotech people, and really these incredibly well-resourced environmental NGOs, worth, with global annual operating budgets in the billions, and all they do is campaign. All they do is engage in this battle of ideas. And what's Team David doing? we're doing what we can, but on very, very limited resources. And the strength of our arguments is what carries us. But I'm certainly looking forward to more organizations coming forward, better resources flowing in, because there's incredible human capacity. There's really, really smart people, making these arguments, and I'm just really hoping to see more of them being able to move into this as a career, because there's a world to win.
Yeah, it'd be pretty amazing. Well, okay, we're approaching 2 hours. This is going to be my longest podcast ever. Anything else that we should cover before?
No, I think that's good. That's a record for me as well, Brett. But
okay, well, Chris, as always, just amazing to watch what you've done. Let's keep collaborating. Let's keep seeing what happens over the next few months, over the next year. This is a wild journey, and I'm just so glad to have people like you on board for it.
Yeah. Well, thanks, man. It's like I say, you've been an inspiration from day one, and it's awesome collaborating with you and learning from you, and getting that optimistic heterodoxy